I'm going to today talk about the creation story. So years ago, Nanabojo and Bibone had a disagreement. And Nanabojo said, Bibone, you are the spirit of the cold weather, the winter, that gives us rest. But I can beat you. I can warm you up. So Nanabojo tried, but Bibone won out. And we had ice here in our land of the Anishinaabe for a long, long time and made the Anishinaabe move away to the south. Nanabojo with them got together with a spirit of the south called Nibin, and Shawin also was involved, which is a spirit of that area. So together, three of them came and made the earth warm again. And so Bibone conceded and said, yeah, I'll be able to negotiate where it'll be cold for 6 months of the year and you can have the warmth for 6 months of the year. So that's how come today in Anishinaabe territory we both have summer and winter, an in-between stage called fall and spring. In this area is the homeland of the Michi Saagig Anishinaabe. The Michi Saagig Anishinaabe are of the bigger group called the Anishinaabe. This has been their traditional territory forever. We were created here, and we're still here. Other people have come and gone, and still visitors come and live with us, and we've given them permission to be here. But just prior to the coming of the European, some interesting dynamics were happening here in Ontario. People from the south came to us and asked if they could grow corn here. We yearly met, made peace with each other. We smoked the pipe together. We made wampum together, which is like a pact, an agreement, a contract. And we do this every year. They recognize this is our traditional territory and they're only visitors. But we let them live here. And we call them the Antawad. Antawad means people who live in houses. You call them the Hurons. Remember, around about that time, other things started to happen. The European introduced some diseases. They also introduced some guns to our traditional Hinmi to the south. And there was skirmishes, and consequently there was dispersal. The Hurons, they were in fact almost eliminated and annihilated. We had to back off a little bit because of disease and the flexing of muscle by the Haudenosaunee Nodwa, as we call them, people to the south who are ones who disagree with it over time, but we could coexist, but it seemed there was this heightened pressure, and so by the mid-1600s, around 1650 to 1655, this part of our country was empty. There's nobody here. We came back here roughly around 1760-ish. We're the original people of the North Shore of Lake Ontario. We're the salmon people. That's what we lived off of. Any river that flowed into Lake Ontario had huge salmon runs that writers of history describe how you could literally walk across these rivers at a certain time of year because of the number of salmon. Many things were happening. The salmon were disappearing. The food sources were disappearing. Settlement was moving in and displacing our people. Agreements were being made at that time, which were kind of one-sided by the colonial governments as how to take over our land.
If the British were going to succeed in holding on to their colonies, they needed to cultivate and maintain the relationship with the First Nations. The Royal Proclamation basically says where lands are not required for settlement, that those lands will remain the Indian hunting grounds. In essence, it established a large Indian reserve, for lack of a better term, which was basically off limits to settlement, to traders, and could only be taken up in treaties with the Crown. So it established the treaty process in essence. So the Royal Proclamation is set down in 1763, but if we fast forward to 1783, that's the first substantial land purchase treaty agreement between the Mississauga Nation and the Crown, and that occurs in what is today the Upper St. Lawrence and the eastern end of Lake Ontario, and that's called the Crawford Purchase, 1783, 1784. And even though the Royal Proclamation had set down the process as to how the treaty process would take place, the Crawford Purchase is probably one of the worst examples of that process. There's no written description of the lands that were taken up. The next treaty along Lake Ontario was the Gunshot Treaty. Another treaty or purchase or settlement that is not written down. There's no lands that were delineated in the Gunshot Treaty, but the understanding was that it conveyed to the Crown land as far as a gunshot could be heard. So, I have to ask myself, who shot the gun? What kind of a gun was it? Was it a cloudy day? Was it a sunny day? Where did the person shooting the gun, where did that person stand? How long away from the gunshot did people stand to draw that line? It's sort of difficult to even conceive of how that was done. We look at the map today and we see lines and states and international boundaries, et cetera, but if we're going to understand this treaty process from the 1780s, we got to get all of that out of our mind. We have to erase those lines, and we have to try to understand what was at stake for the British. The main thing at stake during this time was relocating those settlers who had been loyal to the king during the American Revolution. And so we see pockets of land that are taken up, which are Mississauga land, to initially secure lands for settlement for the Loyalists. The British Crown just didn't come in and say, we want all the land. We need all the land we can get. They didn't use that approach. They took up lands that they could facilitate settlement on sort of at the time. And we see this as we move in off Lake Ontario frontier, Treaty number 20, the 1818 Treaty. The importance of 1818 Treaty number 20 is that when you read the minutes, one can feel the pain and the almost desperation of the people at the time. The Mississauga Nation had 30 years now of a pretty negative experience in seeing and feeling the effect of what those early land purchases had done.
By enforcement of the federal government, we were not allowed legal counsel. The Indian people really believed that the Crown was honorable at the time. They thought the Great White Father would continue to look after them. It just didn't happen.
In the late 1800s, our people said to the government, you are settling into our territory which has never been ceded to you. And finally, the government said one day, okay, we'll form a commission to investigate your claim. And so they went around here on every First Nation, had hearings.
And when they had the Williams Treaty, I was 5 years old, and I remember going over there because I lived right across the road and eavesdropping through the windows and wondering who these guys were. They were speaking a different language than I'd ever heard before. But they had interpreters, and they were Indians from up north.
The Williams Treaty First Nations are the only First Nations in Canada whose rights to hunt and fish have been held to be extinguished by the Supreme Court, by all the courts. At the end of it, a document was produced which may or may not have reflected what people understood, but which certainly within a decade was being interpreted by the province of Ontario as meaning that the people who signed it had given up all their rights. And the moment that that interpretation hit the street, those people were protesting immediately, saying, no, we never would have agreed to that. It's not what it said. I'll go to jail before I'll give up my right to fish or my right to hunt or my right to trap. And many of them did.
We're living on the land, people who live in a sustainable fashion, that we made sure that if we were to use the land, that it would last us forever. However, what happened with the 1923 treaty, because we were forbidden to live on the land, we had to sneak around. Of course, the government on the other side had all kinds of game wardens here. It almost seemed like at times there was an army of game wardens looking over us.
There's a lot of documented evidence where the people said they just gave up trapping because they were being run off the land. In some cases being shot at.
I remember one fellow, they were over at Pigeon Creek spearing muskrats. And the game wardens come along and started chasing them. And this one guy was running away from him, and he jumped over one of those rail fences, and he put his hand down on the rail and rail split with a bullet right beside his hand. He never went hunting or fishing again.
But a lot of people did get put in jail simply for fishing out of season. Not just fines, it was put in jail. As things progressed, planes were chasing them in the winter, ski planes were chasing them in the winter and that. And as technology got better, they were able to keep them closer and closer to home.
Well, I done a lot of fishing and hunting and guiding.
Guiding was something we always did. That was my first job, really, was guiding.
Because won't go up to go. You want to see me, you know, see me go now. Well, give me a time and we know, you know, I'm going to do it. And we got to carry daddy in the way to get. You can guide with the
For some reason, Curve Lake was very popular. The lodge was a fishing lodge, and my grandfather operated it first, and the tourists used to come up by train from New York City or wherever. Doctors and lawyers, they were all doctors and lawyers, professional men in those days. They would come a day a month maybe.
And us boys, we always used to have to live out in the barn when the tourist season was on. Somebody would be in our bedroom, yeah.
The tourist business changed for some reason. Instead of coming for 2 weeks, they'd come for 3 days and then maybe just a weekend and so on. So we eventually got out of it in '71. The reason we got into the gallery business in the first place was to create employment on the reserve at that time. And the older people were doing quill work and basket work and so on with no market for it. So we talked to the older folks and said, if we can organize a business and market the stuff, will you teach the younger ones how to do it? The younger ones learned the old trades from the older people. We had as many as 200 working for us on the reserve in the craft business. And that was in 1960. So we had a real industry going on Curve Lake.
You get the porcupine in around June, just before it gets warm. My mom used to singe the quills off on a slow fire. I soak them in hot water so they get nice and soft. I used to make teepees for the craft shop up here, quite a few of them. And then I started making the quill boxes. I used to go around Stony Lake and to cottagers selling their baskets and their quill work.
So my mom used to have they used to call it a bee, and they'd get together and they'd help each other out making baskets or quill work. They'd kill the porcupine and we'd pick the quills. We'd get some dye and dye the quills. They'd clean the porcupine and we'd eat that. That was good.
And my mother made baskets, and she used to peddle them in the summer. They'd go out in a boat and then they'd go to Bob Cajun. So there was no men in the village in the winter time because they went to lumber camps.
Leave in the fall, and then they maybe come home at Christmas and go back in for break up, and then there was the log drives after that. My stepfather worked in the log drive.
Lumbering was big, and they used to have log drives where they boomed the logs together and floated them down the rivers and so on to the mills in Peterborough. And lumber was what Peterborough was made of, really.
My mother said there's a log drive coming through, and a lot of the boys from Curve Lake here were working on this log drive, eh? And we came to Lakefield, and we watched them there putting the logs through the canal there. It was quite a sight. See them guys running around on top of logs. And it was the last one, yeah. Last time there was a log drive went down. In '42, I joined the army. Everybody else was gone from here. All the boys were gone, and I was the only guy around here putting here. When we got over to France, it was 3 days after D-Day. I was the only chief in our outfit. That was my name, Chief! Come here, So I didn't mind too much.
Quand we went on the Kensin, that Kisha Skilgog, is really getting crash garden door man. Mr. Kimachi Ward, and ki vidge modas ki not mo Curve Lake. And koske in dead emoji in Jipasti Curve Lake and Burley Falls in given to so. He should mock the shiver. He shall go overseas. He was wounded with the construct a whole thing.
We've been involved with wars going back to the War of 1812. We had, I believe it's 20 from this community involved with the First World War. In the Second World War, I think it's 4 to 5 men and women enlist, all returned except 2. And then we had 3 involved in the Korean conflict. They all returned home. So our involvement, not only within our community, but throughout the world, gives guys like me and the members of the community the enthusiasm to continue to move forward.
When I got home, it was in around the 1st of November, I said to some of these guys, "Where are you going?" "They're going on deer hunting." I said, "Leave me a boat on the shore and I'll come up." I came home and dropped off my stuff and got my rifle. Went out deer hunting. First day back. Used to be a lot of rice around these lakes here. All the lakes would be half full of rice. When a guy'd be paddling through the rice beds, you wouldn't be able to see him. The rice grew that high.
This plant was basically a staple in the diet of certainly the Ojibwa and the Algonquin people throughout thousands of years, really. Some of these lakes were just so thick with rice you could barely paddle through it. The native people used it for not only food, but it also attracted a lot of different types of wildlife: deer, moose, muskrat, beaver, all different types of ducks.
Black rice, or minomen is how we say it in Ojibwe, is considered a sacred medicine, a sacred food of our people. It sustained us, and the grains would fall into the bottom of the canoe. The grains would also fall out of the boat, so they reseed for next year. What we learned from our elders about environmental sustainability is that it is part of our very culture, it's our link to our past, and it's the strength of our future. Our people, we still hunt, we still fish, we still gather wild rice, we still gather those sacred medicines that help our people. And we do this with respect.
I grew up in a home where, it was very crowded. I grew up in my grandmother's home. If you look at that, it's sort of like a small community within your household. So we all had our responsibilities, and certainly if you let your responsibility go, then, the rest of the family suffers. But it also expanded to your neighbors. You were there for your neighbors.
Michi Saagig History. He called Savakwana. Kongwegi de Mosesi. Kongwegi walked to see. Yupanegogi Tom was watching.
That was our upbringing. So naturally, as I grew, that was the theme of being the helper of the community.
When you hear a total stranger tell you about Curve Lake and what they have heard, that is a community and the accomplishments of a community. You notice I don't say an individual, you notice I won't say whether it's chief or council, but a community. We get direction and guidance from the community. So that's what makes Curve Lake unique. Back in the 50s, Pow Wow started coming back, and the crowds started growing year after year after year.
Curve Lake is really well known for their Pow Wow in September. I used to always like to watch when they used to have Miss Curve Lake. My granny, Alice, won Mrs. Curve Lake one year, and I thought that was kind of cute. The Petroglyphs is a rock formation that is located just about 20 minutes north of Curve Lake. It is considered a very sacred and spiritual place among the indigenous people of both North and South America. What is on those rocks are carvings by our ancestors. We refer to them as, in the Ojibwe language, Kinimagewapkong Asani. That means the teaching rocks. We no longer allow to have pictures taken there because it's a living entity. The old people believe that if you take a picture of those rocks, it kind of diminishes the spiritual life of those rocks.
And so on. It's a very special place. It's in fact a place where creation occurred, or a form of creation occurred. There's a lot of symbolism there which is consistent with our culture. There's a clan system depicted there. The animals from the underworld are all depicted there. That is the snakes, the skinks that live there, the turtle. The turtle is an animal that helped creation happen from the underworld through cracks on the earth. The other thing that is very significant there is that our people could hear the language being spoken by Manitou in the crack. If you were to try and explain this physically, it's the water itself running underneath there. It's like an underground river would make these sounds and echo. Hence, it sounded like a spirit talking. But of course, we know it was a spirit talking.
We work very closely with the Ministry of Natural Resources and the park staff in regards to any traditional or cultural advice that they need. We are very much trying to give the message to those visitors, those scientists, those anthropologists, those archaeologists, to say this place is a live, living, breathing entity that deserves our respect, a place of prayer and ceremony.
One of the places that we've been doing ceremony at for a long, long time is Jacob's Island. But the old people always said that area there contained a lot of burials, and this was a special ceremonial ground.
My involvement in Jacob Island started in October 2009 when the current owners of the property were constructing a new building. Construction work uncovered and damaged some human remains. And as a consequence, it needed an archaeological investigation to determine the nature and the extent of the buried human remains as the first part of the process for then establishing that area of the island as an official cemetery so it can be protected in perpetuity.
Once you bury something, not necessarily just humans, there are other things that we bury that have spirit. And once they're buried, we want to keep it there. Because the moment you uncover, the new person handles this stuff, that spirit that we had buried becomes alive again and can, in some instances, do harm to you. We had special ceremony there to honor those people and rebury them.
Curve Lake has been involved with the work on Jacob Island right from the very beginning, and we discussed together what needed to be done, both in terms of ensuring that the legal and procedural requirements, the ethical and spiritual component of the work involved as well. So we worked together to ensure that both aims could be met. Working with First Nation communities has been a tremendous privilege. It's no longer really just about the questions of trying to reconstruct how people lived in these landscapes. It's about relating the archaeological questions to the descendant communities. It's about ensuring that the archaeological sites that we find are treated appropriately and respectfully as part of a larger cultural fabric that emanates from the existing First Nation communities.
Consultation, anything that has to do with impacts to our environment, to our natural resources, to our animal and plant life, to historical items, especially the burial sites, any points where artifacts are found, our medicines and plants that we still look to heal ourselves, and ceremonial places, hunting places. Anything that impacts those areas would be a time that would certainly be a call for consultation. If you're not sure that your project requires consultation, it doesn't hurt to ask. And all we ask is that we have that dialogue. That's our life. It has been our life, hunting, fishing, gathering. That's our history. And that's how we came to be. Everything goes back to creation. It is a belief that we are put here to look after what the Creator has given us.
Our legends say that when the First Nation people left the Creator's side, the gift we were given was the gift of spirituality. The obligation that we were given was to look after the earth. That was our responsibility. And it is evident to this very day that our people across Canada, across Turtle Island, take this responsibility still. That means when Mother Earth is being compromised by mining companies, by oil companies, pollution of the water, it's up to us to stand between that destruction, that violation, and that Mother Earth. That's our obligation.
Anything that deters the natural beauty is just not a respectful way to treat our Creator's work here. That's our teaching. We do what we can to make sure that resources are intact and we have sufficient amounts for generations to come.
I'm a historian. That's what I do, that's my passion. And so from that perspective, it's important that I try to work within the community to better understand our own history and better understand our own historical relations with the Crown and in the modern sense with the federal and provincial crowns. I think the one thing that is the underlying issue for me is that in the public school system, our history has been pretty spotty. A better understanding of the First Nations story in this country, in this region, needs to be told.
You know, just going back and looking at it with regards to claims and treaties and those types of things, never heard much of them during school. Never learned much about them until things started happening in the 70s and 80s and 90s when the courts were making some decisions that were affecting all First Nations across Canada. In 2003, got word from the federal government that they were going to accept a couple of claims. We did settle the Islands of the Trent claim. When they did the 1818 treaty, they included the lands, but they did not include the islands. So when they were selling those islands on our behalf, we were not getting proper compensation for them. That was 1837, they started flooding for the Trent Canal. We lost areas of land and so on. So we filed a claim and we did get compensation on that. We think it's fair compensation for that. But that's, right from 1835 to now, it's almost 200 years. The other claim that we've got going now is one where when they set aside the reserve, they flooded. They didn't compensate us for that. So some of our land is underwater right out the islands and that. October 2012, the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Natural Resources sent a letter out to the chiefs of the Williams Treaty, the 7 First Nations, saying, well, geez, maybe the 1923 Williams Treaty wasn't trying to get rid of existing treaty rights. If the basket clause has any effect, it's got effect on future rights. It doesn't have any effect on past rights. You still have the right to hunt, fish, trap, gather. You can continue to do that.
We're getting volumes and volumes of historical information that are coming out of the litigation. How do we get that information from where it sits now in the Federal Court of Canada? How do we get that into the public school system, into the high school system? That's the key, I think, is education, helping people of all stripes understand this better.
I also think that education is a big thing. We need young people to want to be leaders in this community. We need to inspire them to get their education and be part of the leadership in the future.
What's really important to the future of Curve Lake is the young people. It's important that the young people know at least conversational Ojibwe. It is that language of the people that really is the culture. So it's our challenge now as Curve Lake First Nation to maintain and to revitalize that language, Anishinaabemowin.
In Curve Lake, you can still hear the language, and that's a real beautiful thing about Curve Lake, is that the language has been maintained and it's been nourished and fed, and the people today are able to build on what's always been there. It's a great community. It's beautiful land. It's played an important part of my life.
I think Curve Lake is pretty special. I think that we're a very close-knit community. We plan together, we work together, we play together. So naturally we celebrate together.
And I would encourage anyone, whether they're a youth, a young adult, or even an adult, to get involved with your community. No matter what the issue is, no matter what the event is, no matter what the circumstance is, get involved with your community so that you know what your community is all about. If more people get involved, the better community you will have.
It seems to me to be a place where I belong.
Yeah.